I knew the 2024 free agent wide receiver class was good, but I didn't expect it to be this strong. Based on the most important data points for wide receivers historically, we have players that compare favorably to names like Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, and Brandon Marshall. And best of all, these wide receivers are all priced at their floor right now in fantasy drafts. In fact, there's one name that's not even going inside the top 48 wide receivers. The first name we've got to talk about is Michael Pittman of the Colts, only going to be 27 years old next season. He is still in his prime. We can obviously see the Colts still exercise the franchise tag on Pittman, but as of this recording, he is still available. And when you look at the setup for this visual, just a couple of quick notes. There is a very specific reason that you have the data points you see, which are target share, you have targets per route run, air yard share, and yards per route run. And it's because based on the last 13 years of data, those are the data points that correlate the most strongly with scoring fantasy points and having staying power year over year. Those are the two things we want: high correlation to points, as well as data points that we can depend on year to year. Now, yards per route run, not as strong as target earning and air yards in the consistency department, but still strong enough to make the cut here. And then the other thing you see below Pittman's name, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, those are benchmarks for the last 3 years of what a wide receiver 1 to 12 has done in these categories, and then 13 to 24, and then 25 to 36. And for Pittman, we can see last season, he cleared wide receiver 1 thresholds in the target earning department as well as the air yards. Now, he wasn't quite there in yards per route run, but 3 out of 4 boxes the 27-year-old was able to check. So let's take a look at who the closest comps are for Michael Pittman based on this profile and his age group. And in order to create these comp groups, I looked at the last 2 years of those most important data points we just talked about, and also I looked at the raw data, so the targets per game and the air yards per game, just to make sure we have a strong baseline. And then I compared them to similar age players, and then what did they do in the following seasons? And the comp group, it's really good for Michael Pittman. We have Chris Godwin, Julian Edelman, and Keenan Allen. So all low-end wide receiver ones. You can see those are similar players, often played the Z or they moved inside of the slot. Not big vertical threats, but can still get enough targets to get to that air yards threshold we want for a wide receiver 1. And then the final comp was Golden Tate, another similar player. And he was a mid-range wide receiver 2. So for Pittman, when I look at his outlook for the 2024 fantasy season, I think at worst, he's a low-end wide receiver 2, but in the right landing spot on a team that throws the ball more, they're looking for that chain mover, he could be a mid-range wide receiver 1 to low-end wide receiver 1. If he stays with the Colts, I think we look at him as a mid-range wide receiver 2 to high-end wide receiver 2. But right now, he's going as the wide receiver 19 in fantasy drafts, so there is some value on Pittman if you want to seize it today. Now, my number 2 ranked free agent wide receiver is Mike Evans of the Buccaneers. Now, the Bucs want to get an extension done with Evans. We'll see what happens there. But wow, this is a guy that even though he's heading into his age 31 season, at the age of 30, played very well, nearly at that wide receiver 1 threshold from a target earning perspective, and got well over the wide receiver 1 threshold for air yards at 40% versus that 32% we typically see from wide receiver 1s. And then his 2.32 yards per route run, that was borderline wide receiver 1 worthy. Now for the comps for Evans, I isolated down to only wide receivers moving from age 30 to 31 based on seasons from 2011 to 2023. Now, I did this just to be careful. I personally think that age is a little bit overrated, but it's enough of a factor. I didn't want to include anything that shouldn't be a good comp. But because of that, it really took my sample size down. So I also added another data point, and that was fantasy points per game. And if you look at the comps, there were some hits, but there were also some misses. So not as safe as a profile as what we have with Michael Pittman Jr., but I do think there's plenty of upside here for Mike Evans. If we look at the top of the list, we've got Brandon Marshall. That one's really interesting because that was also the year that Brandon Marshall went from playing for the Bears to the Jets. So we had a team change involved. He went from 13.9 fantasy points to 21.5. Then we have Keenan Allen, who had scored 16.8 fantasy points. He ends up scoring 21.1 fantasy points in his age 31 season. And then finally, Adam Thielen went from 16.8 to 15.4. Now, there were some misses for the profile on Evans, moving from age 30 to 31. Now, I think he's better than both of these players. His career has been better, but I don't think we can dismiss them because these are guys that depended more on getting targets deeper down the field, similar to what Evans does. If we think about the other group where we compared Evans, we had guys operating inside, getting in there from the slot. You had Keenan Allen, you had Adam Thielen, and then you even had Brandon Marshall, who was more of a possession-style wide receiver. But when we look at these misses, we've got Marvin Jones Jr. He went from 14.2 fantasy points per game down to 10.6, and then Vincent Jackson went from 15.2 down to 11.4. So when you look at the range of outcomes for Evans, I do think they're wider than what we have for Pittman. I still think he can give you that mid-range wide receiver one finish. I think a preferable landing spot would be to stay in Tampa with Baker Mayfield. Because if you think back to Tom Brady, when defenses wanted to give those two high safety looks or a deep safety, he would just check it down to the tight end, to the running back, whereas Baker was much more willing to stay locked on to Mike Evans. So landing spot could be a key factor for Evans, and if it doesn't go well, I could see him falling into that wide receiver 3 conversation for 2024. Now, before we get to the wide receiver that everyone is forgetting about, we've got another underrated name to talk about here, and it's Calvin Ridley. I'm going to be honest with you guys, Ridley burned me last season, so I probably had some recency bias coming into this, and I didn't expect him to grade this well in the process. But when I let go of everything and just let the data lead me, there's some really good things here about Ridley. When we look at the target share, 23%, that was wide receiver 2 worthy, but this was an offense with a lot of weapons. You had Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Marvin Jones Jr. on and off the field. If you look at the routes where you didn't have Christian Kirk on the field, Ridley actually had a 26% target share, which would have been wide receiver 1 worthy. Now, the 38% air yards was wide receiver 1 worthy. I know it's going to drive people crazy because a lot of those people will say were prayer yards, but we don't really care. All we care is, was the intent there? Were they trying to get in the ball down the field? And we know these data points matter. So let's take a look at the comps for Mr. Ridley. Now, before I dive into these comps, I just want to reiterate, I'm just following the data. I'm not guaranteeing that Ridley's going to be these players, but when you hear their names, we've got to at least consider the fact that right now he probably shouldn't be the wide receiver 35 off the board, especially if he gets out of Jacksonville. If he stays there, I get it. But that first name is Stephon Diggs. And when Stephon Diggs was in this range of his career, he had wide receiver 5 and wide receiver 9 finishes. And then another similar archetype player, not a really big wide receiver, a little bit slender, but could work all levels of the field. And that was Emmanuel Sanders. He was the wide receiver 21 and the wide receiver 7 in those seasons that were close to what we're talking about with Ridley. And then we had AJ Green at wide receiver 5, wide receiver 15, a taller version of what we have with Ridley, but also, again, another player that wasn't, 215, 220 pounds. AJ Green was more slender than what we had with a guy like Julio Jones, stretching that vertical boundary, but could also work other areas of the route tree. Things that Ridley can do, but wasn't always asked to last season because you had Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram working on the inside. Now, there was a comp that popped up that wasn't necessarily a great one, and it was Mike Wallace. And he had one season where it was a wide receiver 28 and then basically disappeared. So there is a downside here with Ridley, but based on how strong several of those comps are, and again, just following the data, I think we've got to consider the fact that the range of outcomes for Ridley still includes he could be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football in the right landing spot. If he remains in Jacksonville, where it's very crowded, without a big step forward from Trevor Lawrence, it's going to be difficult for Ridley to break out of that wide receiver 3 mold. Now let's take a look at that player that's going wide receiver 51 right now in fantasy drafts. Nobody really wants much to do with him, but it's Marquise Brown for the Cardinals. We'll see if he ends up changing teams, but there's some things to like here about his profile. 22% target share, that's wide receiver 2 worthy, and he's been around that mark in games played for several of his seasons, because what I'm doing here is excluding games that were missed. And then that air yard share, also 35%. That's at a wide receiver 1 level. Now, the yards per route run fell very flat. didn't make even that wide receiver 3 level. So a lot of folks are burned out on Marquise Brown because he has shown us these type of metrics in the past, but not been able to really take that next step in his game. But with all of that said, when we look at the comps, I think people are discounting him too much. Now, looking at the Marquise Brown comp group, it's really interesting because I thought there would be quite a few bust profiles that we would have to weave our way through, and that just wasn't the case. Now, I didn't find big high-end wide receiver 1 finishes, so we're looking more at that wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 profile, but it was really consistent. We have guys like Brandon Cooks, Deontay Johnson, and Tyler Lockett. So you're talking high-end wide receiver 2 to low-end wide receiver 2 type players in those seasons where they comped most closely. Now, Deontay Johnson, he's had a wide receiver 39 and a wide receiver 46 finish, but he's also had a top 12 finish, and he's very similar to Marquise Brown. He teases us with these underlying data points, but he doesn't always come through on it. Also interesting, Mike Williams was the other name that popped up. So talk about opposite of just being small and fast. But again, another guy that can stretch the vertical boundary, can chew up those air yards. So I don't know that Marquise Brown ever turns into this super high-end target earning machine, but he's going to be at that wide receiver 2 level. And if he still has the ability to stretch out the field and beat some of those coverages when you get the man-to-man looks, that's going to be really positive for him. So my outlook for him is treat him right now as a low-end wide receiver 3. He shouldn't be getting drafted as a wide receiver 5. If he lands on the right team in a perfect situation, I think his ceiling is still as high as a high-end wide receiver 2. I have got some exciting news for you. We have teamed up with DraftKings Sportsbook to help bring you the ultimate game day experience. Right now, all new customers can earn up to $2,500 in your first 72 hours. Deposit a minimum of $500 and earn a $500 bonus bet for every $1,000 bet on DraftKings Sportsbook. Bets must settle within 72 hours of opting in. Sign up using my promo code DEBRIEF. The crown is yours.